Growing up as a West Coast kid, sand and water are a part of my soul. I love coming and experiencing the wideness and the beauty that's found at the beach. It's a place that's moving and dancing and full of so much life and energy. I love being able to breathe in the salty air and to experience all the sounds and movement that happens here. I love being able to walk for miles on end and sometimes just to sit and simply enjoy the space that I'm in. The beach is my sacred space because it's a place that I've often experienced God's presence and voice in my life. The Celtic Christians of ancient Ireland had a fabulous name for this type of sacred space. They called it a thin place. It's the moment where heaven seems to touch earth, a place where you can catch a glimpse of the divine and perhaps connect to God in a special way. Last week, Pastor Ken introduced our brand new series called Sacred Spaces. And each week we're filming from a different location around our city that can speak to us and perhaps allow us to experience God in a fresh and tangible way. For me, it's the beach. A lot of times I'll come here if I have a big decision to make. And I find that just being here in a big space allows me to think and pray and reimagine life. Sometimes I'll come if I'm wrestling through a tension or a question or a doubt in my life or my faith. And I find walking the shoreline often allows me to clear my head and just to recenter and refocus my life. Sometimes I'll come and simply just take in the view. And I find my lungs and myself get filled with gratitude and thankfulness of being in a beautiful space like this. I'm sure that many of you feel the same way. And the beach really does feel like a sacred space, because it's a place that can speak to us. The beach also connects to one of my favorite Jesus stories, a story that has shaped and is continuing to shape my faith journey. I want to read it to you, and it's from Luke chapter 5. One day, as Jesus was preaching on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, crowds gathered to listen to the word of God. Jesus noticed 2 empty boats at the water's edge, for the fishermen had left them and were washing their nets. And stepping into one of the boats, Jesus asked Peter to push the boat out into the water. When he had finished speaking, he said to Peter, "Now, launch out where it's deeper and let down your nets, and you will catch many fish." "Master," Peter replied, "we worked hard all last night and didn't catch a thing. But if you say so, I'll let the nets down again." And this time their nets were so full of fish, they began to tear. A shout for help brought their partners in the other boat, and soon both boats were filled with fish and on the verge of sinking. I love this story because it speaks to the range of emotions and experiences that we so often face in life. And so today I want to connect a few of the pieces of this Jesus story to some of the pieces in our own life, because I think there's some beautiful truths here that can help us as we learn to follow Jesus. The story begins with a problem. Peter and his fishing buddies have just returned from an all-night fishing trip where they've gotten skunked. They haven't caught a single fish. Now, if fishing were merely your hobby, it wouldn't be so bad. But if your livelihood and your job actually depends on it, then it's very troubling. And so Peter and his buddies are sitting around there and they're tired, they're disappointed, they're frustrated as they stare at their empty nets. But I love that Jesus isn't put off or surprised by their emptiness or by the seeming lack of success. In fact, I think it's just the opposite. I think Jesus actually looks for those types of challenging situations in our own lives so that he can come alongside of us and do something about it. Maybe that describes you today. Maybe you're in a place that you feel stuck or empty. Maybe you've come through a time of disappointment or grief or loss or failure. And yet, even though that can feel overwhelming, Jesus wants to come alongside of us to fill us and to see our lives transformed into something beautiful and unexpected. Jesus doesn't see a problem. he sees an opportunity. And he calls Peter over and he says to him, Peter, I know that you've come through a rough night. I know that you're disappointed, that you're frustrated. I know that things haven't turned out for you the way that you thought that they would. That's your reality, that's your experience. And yet I'm not going to leave you in that place. And so this is what we're gonna do. I'm gonna go with you in the empty boat. And I want you to launch deep and to cast your net on the other side. And you might just be surprised by what happens next. Well, this had to have sounded crazy. Peter's a fisherman. He's been fishing the waters his entire life. He knows where the best fishing holes are. He knows where the worst places are to fish. And here, Jesus, a carpenter turned preacher, is giving him, a fisherman, fishing advice on when and how and where to fish. And not only that, it feels wrong on so many levels. It feels like the wrong time and timing. Peter's always fished at night. That's what he's always done. And now Jesus is asking him to do it in a different way. And not only that, it feels like the wrong place, the one that's not on Peter's GPS fish finder. And so for Peter, this had to have sounded crazy. And yet Jesus says to him, I want you to launch deep. I want you to go beyond what you've ever experienced before, further than something that you've known. Well, that can be a real challenge for us in life. We so often feel way more comfortable being in the place that we've always known, the place that we've experienced, the place where our memories and those previous events have taken place. And so to take a step of faith into something new, into something different, is a big risk, and it can feel so uncomfortable. Neuroimaging studies have shown that as we get older, our cognitive center tends to shift from right brain, where imagination is processed, to left brain, which is where rationale and logic happens. What that means is that as we get older, we tend to make decisions that are based more on our previous experiences and memories, rather than looking ahead to what could be. I think we're seeing this type of thinking happening, especially now during COVID. How many of us, myself included, have made statements such as, oh, I can't wait until things get back to normal, until they get back to the way things were. And yet the reality is that things aren't going to go fully back to the way that they were, because our jobs have changed, maybe schooling has changed. We can't travel to the same places that we used to. But here's the question that I think we can take from this Jesus story today. What if Jesus is actually inviting us into something new? What if he's inviting us into a new experience and a new way of thinking that we haven't experienced before? What if we as individuals and perhaps as a 10th church community are being invited to come into a new opportunity that has never existed before? What if Jesus is inviting us into something new? When I come to the beach, I'm reminded of those two questions. Am I going to be a person who lives out of my previous memories and experiences and certainty? And how am I going to respond to Jesus' invitation to step into something new? I think the beach provides a beautiful visual reminder of that. At the place where the water meets the sand, where the water impacts and touches the rocks, there's this movement that happens, this churning and almost turbulence of the water. And I think that's really the reality that Peter and also we as Jesus followers face. I don't know about you, but I kind of like being on the sand because it feels more solid, it feels more certain and stable. And to move beyond that place into the waters where things change and move and shift and where storms can come up and where all sorts of movement happens, it can feel uncomfortable. And yet, if the beach is to be a sacred space for me and for you, I have to remind myself that my life was never meant to be lived safely on shore. But instead, I'm called as a Jesus follower to step out into places that are deeper, that are more uncertain, that are different. And yet, it's a beautiful place to go. I want you to notice the first part of Peter's response to Jesus' invitation. Peter says, Jesus, we worked hard all last night and we didn't catch a thing. It's the reality that Peter is sitting in this moment and place of disappointment and grief and loss. And I'm sure the last thing that Peter wants to do now is to get up and to try again. Sometimes that's one of the hardest things to do in life when we've come through a failure or a loss or a disappointment. And that's to get up and to try again. That response really resonates with me. As I look back on my life, I've come through some painful job losses and transitions. And there are times where for months on end, I would be applying for job after job, only to be rejected and told no. And that took a huge toll on me, physically, emotionally, spiritually. It ate away at my identity and my self-worth as a person, as a provider for my family, as a leader. And yet, in a place like that, even though I wanted to give up so many times, I knew that I couldn't. I knew that I couldn't stay in that place, as easy as it might be to stay in comfort and predictability and safety. I knew Jesus was calling me to continue to move forward and to trust him in that. What can we learn from Peter's response? That it's okay to name the moment that you're in. That it's okay to name the frustrations, the grief, the loss, the disappointment that you might be feeling. Sometimes when I come to the beach, I like to grab rocks. And I love throwing them out over the water. I think there is this holy action of being able to let go. When you see a rock fly out of your hand and go sailing over the water and it hits the water and sinks to the bottom. What a great picture that is. Some of you may want to come to the beach this week and grab some rocks and name them. Call it disappointment or loss, grief, whatever that moment is that you might be experiencing. And as you let them go, you can declare that you will not be defined by what you're holding on to. You're not going to be defined by grief or loss or disappointment or pain. And speak that and allow Jesus to work through even that action of letting go. You might end up a little bit messy, but that's okay. That's what Jesus is calling us and inviting us into, to be able to let go of the places and the moments that we find ourselves in. Peter's story begins in loss, but it doesn't end there. He says, we worked hard all last night, we didn't catch a thing, but if you say so, we'll try again. It's not that Peter's come up with this new way or this new idea of how to fish or where to fish. It's not that he's trying to figure it out and do it in his own ability. Peter is simply responding to the voice of Jesus, and he responds with courage and with trust. When I come to the beach and I look out over the horizon and I see the depth and the vastness of the ocean, it reminds me that even though I like to be on the safety of the shore and the solidness of the ground, to actually realize that when Jesus is pushing me and calling me to launch out into the deep, listening to his voice is actually the most secure thing that I could ever hold on to. And it fills me with courage and it allows me to continue to say yes to him. And here Peter says, Jesus, this may not make sense. The timing might seem a little bit weird. I may be tired. I may be exhausted. I may end up looking pretty silly with this. But because you say so, I'm going to try again. Because you say so, I'm going to go for it. Even if it looks silly, even if it looks ridiculous, I'm going to go for it. Some of you may remember the movie We Bought a Zoo. Matt Damon plays the character of a British writer named Benjamin Mee. It's based on a true life story where Mee takes over and rescues a failing zoo, and at the same time is coming to terms with his life as a widower and as a single father. And in this one brilliant scene and moment from the movie, Damon's character says these beautiful words. Sometimes all you need is 20 seconds of courage. Just literally 20 seconds of just embarrassing bravery. And I promise you, something great will come of it. I think there's this gap between verses 5 and 6 of the Jesus story that we've read. In verse 5, Peter says, "At your word, we're going to try it again. We're going to let down our nets." And then in verse 6, it says, "And this time their nets were so full, they began to break." I like to think of that gap between verses 5 and 6 as a white space, as a blank canvas upon which Jesus is going to work. And here for Peter, it had to have taken literally 20 seconds of insane courage. Can you imagine him in that moment? What must have been going on in his mind? Maybe even what he heard his friends saying in the boat with him. "Peter, what are you doing? This isn't how you do it. This isn't how you fish. You can't launch on that side of the boat. You can't cast your nets on that side. What are you doing?" And yet Peter responds with bold courage. He listens to Jesus' voice. And in an instant of time, in one moment, he experiences something he could never have imagined. His nets are so full, they actually begin to break. It's the reality that Jesus has for Peter. It's also the reality that Jesus has for our lives. In the past, Michelle and I have shared pieces of our story with you about how God led our family to 10th Church and to UBC. In closing, I want to share another piece of that story because it really connects to this Jesus story that we read today. In the summer of 2016, we had made a painful decision to shut down the church that we had started in Langley. It was a difficult time. It was painful. We were broken. We were grieving this loss. We weren't sure where God was going to take us next. And at the same time, a church in our denomination suddenly opened up in Vancouver, very close to UBC on the west side of the city. And I felt in that moment when I heard about it that God began speaking to me and planting a bit of a seed and a dream inside of me. And honestly, it seemed kind of weird, the timing, because the one reality, we were facing this grief and loss and disappointment and pain of a church community that we had invested our lives into, and now that dream was coming to an end. And we were broken. We were grieved. And at the same time, I couldn't shake the sense that God was actually calling us to trust him and to take this step, even though it didn't make sense at the time, and to take a step into Vancouver. And I remember the timing seemed really weird. And to be honest, Michelle wasn't feeling what I was feeling, and yet I couldn't shake this deep sense of Jesus' invitation to us to take a step. I remember one day driving out from our home in Langley to Vancouver, and I came down to the beach and I wanted to spend some time praying and thinking. And I knew that I was going to wrestle with a question: what am I going to do? Because on the one hand, we were feeling, could we ever step back into church ministry again? We're exhausted, we're tired, we're dealing with this disappointment and this loss. How could we ever think about loving and pastoring a community again? And long story short, we decided to keep saying yes, even when it didn't make sense. And we kept taking these small steps of faith forward. What I couldn't know, what I didn't know was that as we were taking these steps, that something was happening deep below the surface. Other stories that were taking place. Pastor Ken, the board, 10th Church, were beginning to dream and to talk about launching a new site on the UBC campus. What we didn't know was how all these stories were going to connect. Until suddenly one day it was like a bam, this sudden movement that happened. And we realized that all of these stories had connected, and God opened the door for us to come to 10th UBC. It was a moment that we'll never forget, because we realized that we were stepping into a moment that Jesus had designed for us and for our lives. And it was beautiful and it was unexpected. Here's the question I want to leave you with today. What might Jesus be inviting you to? For some of you, it might be an invitation to leave your past behind, to leave behind those things that you've held on to, those things that have perhaps defined you and have had a grip on you. For some of you, you've already sensed Jesus' invitation into something new. And today, maybe he's asking you to make that next step, to make that next decision. Maybe you need to reach out to someone. Maybe Jesus is inviting you to trust him in a new way, with your finances, with your career, with your schooling, with relationships. What is Jesus inviting you to today? I want to encourage you to find your way down to a beach this week. Maybe throw some rocks. But mostly, listen and ask Jesus that question. How am I being called to trust? Where am I being invited to? Jesus, is there a place that you want me to throw my nets into today? The next time you come to the beach, let it be a beautiful reminder to continue to lean and live into the reality that Jesus invites you to embrace. And now, may you be filled today with fresh courage to trust Jesus, to listen to his voice, to launch out into the deep, and to see where the adventure may lead. Amen.